Yatta. My name's Rueben Berg. I'm a representative for Eastern Mar on the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria and one of the co-chairs of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. And I thought I'd just take this chance to talk in a bit more detail about the minimum standards required for the Assembly to enter into statewide treaty negotiations. And to do that, I'm going to be talking through key aspects of the treaty negotiation framework, which you can see up here on the screen. And this is available for everybody to find on the Assembly's website. And this talks about many of the different elements of treaty negotiations, both statewide and local traditional owner treaties. But today I'm just going to be looking specifically around the requirements for the Assembly to negotiate statewide treaty. And so to do that, we're going to jump down to section 16 of the framework, and this sets out what those requirements are. And just to give a bit of the broader context around this, you hopefully would be familiar that in December last year, the Treaty Authority was appointed, 5 members of that Treaty Authority, and that was one of the key next steps for treaty negotiations. And the Treaty Authority is now in the process of setting up the negotiations database, which will be the mechanism for which the Assembly can say we would like to negotiate statewide treaty. In order to do that, we have to demonstrate and we have to affirm ourselves that the Assembly meets what we recall here the minimum standards for the body, in this case the body being the Assembly, to enter into negotiations. So these are the requirements. The state has its own requirements. Traditional owner groups, delegations have their own requirements. These are the requirements that are specifically for the Assembly if we want to negotiate statewide treaty. And the Assembly is currently doing work to determine how we meet these minimum standards and to ensure that we do meet these minimum standards. But before we move to that, I think it's just important that community can have a good understanding of what these standards are actually about. So the key parts of these standards are here in 16.2. And as with lots of parts of this framework, we do talk about self-determination. And in this case, we talk about self-determination through the lens of it's up to the body, the Assembly itself, to determine whether we satisfy minimum standards, subject to a chance for community to comment on our satisfaction of those standards. All minimum standards are categorised under these different headings you can see in bold here, and that's land and waters, community, leadership and inclusivity. And these are the particular parts of that relate to the Assembly wanting to be the body to negotiate statewide treaty. But so I'll take you through these. So 16.2b, you'll see there that in relation to land and waters, the body must identify the land and waters that constitute what is now known as the state of Victoria and all other land and waters vested in the state as the area over which it intends to negotiate a statewide treaty. So that's pretty straightforward. The Assembly would say we want to negotiate over the whole of the state of Victoria as part of our negotiations, and that's what's required there. The next part is in relation to community, and it says that the body, the Assembly, must identify how it represents the diversity of First Peoples in Victoria. That's about the breadth of First Peoples who are able to participate, so not just Victorian traditional owners, but the broader First Peoples community, that they're able to be represented and participate in the elections for the Assembly. And those sorts of things are captured within that aspect of represents the diversity. The next one there is incorporated, and that's a pretty straightforward one about the legal status. The next one there, C, is around the governance structure. And so the body needs to make sure it's got a governance structure made up of traditional owners who are either elected by First Peoples through periodic statewide elections or appointed by traditional owner groups. And last year we held the elections that comply with that element. The next one there, D, is that must identify how it has processes in place to engage with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, Aboriginal trusts, and First Peoples who are not traditional owners. And so this is there to make sure that the Assembly has processes to not just engage with traditional owners, but the broader community, the broader organisations out there, and that's a requirement that is placed upon the Assembly to have those processes. The next one there is in relation to leadership. And so the body, the Assembly, must identify processes to choose representatives who will be the negotiators as a part of treaty, that they will have chosen those negotiators, that there's a decision-making process in place in which the body would make decisions specifically around treaty. So there's clear processes and procedures about how you make decisions regarding treaty. And the last one there, D, is about the capacity to attend and offer advice and support to First Peoples treaty delegations. So for traditional owner treaties, if requested, the Assembly and the body can play a role in supporting those traditional owner treaties. So the body, in part of minimum standards, has to show it's got that capacity to do that, has the scope to be able to do that. The next one then there is around inclusivity, and this is a very particular aspect of inclusivity. So it's around making sure that there are processes in place to uphold cultural authority, educate and consult First Peoples, including traditional owners, Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and Aboriginal trusts regarding treaty negotiations. And that's just an inclusive definition. So there's other broader groups. We also need to make sure that are educated, that there's processes in place to educate and consult about treaty negotiations. And the last one is around processes to seek the collective support of First Peoples to the outcomes of treaty negotiations, so that when the Assembly does go to sign off on a treaty outcome or an interim agreement, there's a process that community understands about what that will look like to approve those final outcomes. So those are the minimum standards that we're currently working through to make sure that we do meet those and that we can demonstrate that we meet those. And those are, as it says there though, just the minimum standards. I think in a lot of these places we as an Assembly have higher aspirations about how we want to do our business. But in order to be able to negotiate statewide treaty, at a minimum, we must meet these requirements. And so that's some really important work that's happening at the moment. The additional requirements that apply have all been met already by the Assembly. And that is that before the last statewide elections, we did a big announcement about our intention to be the primary negotiating party. And we outlined some of the reasons how we think we intend to meet those minimum standards. And there's also a requirement to notify the treaty authority of the statewide election period. And that was really just there in the case that if the treaty authority had been put in place before our elections, that the treaty authority didn't start this process while the Assembly was still undertaking its elections. So those are those minimum standards. Expect to hear more from the Assembly about how we are meeting those. And once we do submit our application, then there will be that period of comment and discussion from the broader community about how the Assembly meets those minimum standards. Hopefully that's been useful. If you've got any questions, never hesitate to reach out. Thanks. Well, look.